We were inspired to create the Forest Refuge. It's probably about 25 years ago. Actually, this was in the late 90s. And IMS was flourishing. We were getting a lot of retreatants. And we were trying to envision what the next step might be. Whether just to enlarge IMS and make a bigger hall and have bigger retreats. And nobody really was too enthusiastic about that idea. Well, what would be the next step? And in the course of the discussion, I was reminded of my own earlier practice in India, which I loved. Because at that time, there were not formal meditation courses. I was just practicing in India, basically on my own, but with teacher support. So I would go visit my teacher, Munindraji, several times a week, or maybe 4 times a week, to report on my practice. And the rest of the time, I was just practicing on my own. And I loved it. I really just loved it, because I was creating my own schedule, and following my own natural rhythm of practice. And I thought, wouldn't it be fantastic to create a place where people could do long-term practice with support, but with a lot of individual responsibility, right? So people could find their own rhythm and settle into their own unfolding practice. And so people really got on board with the idea of creating a place where that kind of practice could be done. And part of the vision of that was also to provide a place where people could come for varying lengths of time, and it has served that function. And we had some people who stayed for years in practice. And that's a bit unusual, but many people spend many months at a time. So that really is fulfilling the initial vision, what we thought would be possible.
Well, you would have to understand that this project was an idea in Joseph Goldstein's mind for many years before it actually started. I can remember being on retreat with him where he was talking about being on retreat himself and how his mind would think about what an ideal retreat center would look like, how it would be structured, and where the med hall would be, and all the different ins and outs of it. So in a certain kind of way, I suppose we're beneficiaries of Joseph's self-described papancha, or ruminating mind. But it kind of looks like the time that he put into that thought was really beneficial, because when it came time to actually build what he idealized, there were a lot of good ideas in place.
It's interesting how we decided on this spot, this location. We did feel it would be important to have it in the vicinity of IMS, because it was connected as part of the institution. But in those days, this was mostly forest and some just wild meadows. And I was simply walking around in the forest, taking hikes in the forest, and walked through this particular area. I just had to thought, boy, this would be a great place to locate this new center. And so that's how it really came about. I think that the ultimate design of the layout, we got connected with another architect, but who had studied and practiced feng shui in China. And he was also a Dharma student. So he was a gem, and he came in during the design process. So we were still, working on the blueprints. And we just went through the whole building from a feng shui point of view. And it was so interesting. I remember one day, he and I were just sitting at my dining room table with all the plans. We spent a whole day going through each building and each of the connectors, and he would just point out from that perspective, okay, where does the energy flow? Where is it blocked? What needs to be adjusted? And I was just amazed how some very small changes made a huge difference. So that was another big contributing factor, I think, in how well a design serves the function.
This place has been created with a tremendous amount of love and generosity, and everything about it, from the floors to the layout of the center to the hall to the way in which there's, to the council house, or everything about the center reflects that. You can feel that.
It's a kind of deep, deep sort of hospitality. I think of it as spiritual hospitality, that all of us, the staff and the teachers and everything, and the yogis, we make it together. It comes together. It's a codependent thing. It's like we do our best to create the space, and all the people have come before, and then you come in and you feel something, you recognize something, you're coming forward with some intention to practice, to be with the Dharma. And so maybe what happens when you come through the door is some alchemy, something quite magical can happen.
Well, it's very quiet here. It's just really quiet. So there's a real emphasis on seclusion here, seclusion that supports the practice. One of the interesting things about teaching here, especially in open months, is that you have a whole range of people here. Like, you may have somebody coming in who intends to be here for 2 weeks and just got here. And then you may have someone who's been here for 6 months. And they're all there in the meditation hall for the Dharma talk.
It's the thing about the being at the FR is that there's just, I think, the silence that's here, the number of folks that have practiced here, the Dhamma, this place is steeped in it. So I never feel lost. I think it almost feels impossible to be completely lost here, because there are resources here. And it's remarkable because you're on your own in a sense, but you are being held with this community of people that you see right in front of you, and you're being held with this community of people going back 2,600 years. So you're never actually quite alone here.
Just allow people time to settle in and just be, custodian of the process of the person beginning to find their own ground. Yeah. And then beginning to pick up themes that gladden, such as loving kindness, such as one is living a harmless, sober, honest life. And that's not just an idea, that's a beautiful quality when you take it into your heart. So asking people to remember their own values and treasures and just linger in it, so it's not just a flickering idea. So all this helps to establish the person in their own authority, and that's very important.
You've been given this, or you've come into this space where you don't have to be someone. You don't have to play a role. You can just come, and there's space for you to be however you are, and nobody will come around and keep prodding you and saying, what are you doing? Do this, do that. How are you doing? Is it going well? You're kind of left in a way alone, but in a supportive, friendly space.
So one of the visions we had for the Forest Refuge was that it would be a place for more experienced practitioners to come because we did want it to be people who are more self-reliant in their practice.
And I particularly love coming to the FR to teach because it's a little bit smaller group. It's typically myself and someone else, and I get to have a good amount of engagement with yogis over their time here. So it's really special and sweet to have, weekly contact with a yogi that's here for 10 days or for a month or longer or 7 days to really be able to support them in their practice in that way.
So the teaching can really, in a way, go more directly, you might say, to the depth of the Buddhist teachings or more subtleties of the teachings, more technical aspects perhaps, that are meaningful to people who have a little more experience in practice.
The retreat center, everybody enters at the same time. So even though they may have different levels of experience, kind of the kind of talk that would make the most sense in terms of the progression of the course is a little bit clearer. Here I find I really rely more on my intuition about what to offer.
Practitioners here are pretty seasoned and they have practice under their belt, so they're very, tend to be really, have a good sense of what's needed for their own practice, and it's really wonderful to support people who have been so dedicated. And so it's a meeting of really kind of seasoned old Dharma friends is what it often feels like when you're supporting practitioners like that. So there is that sense of really being immersed in the Dharma together that is joyful, actually. As a teacher, it's really joyful to support practitioners who are doing that kind of dedicated practice.
Feeling they have the authority and the potential to reset their lives incrementally, like, I think I've had enough of that. I need to do more of this, and let's put that aside and I'll give that up. To shape their lives in accordance with their true benefit and wealth in it. If they can do that, I'd be very pleased indeed. And many people do, incremental ways. They're not trying to conform to some imagined profile of what they should be. They're fully inhabiting where they are. They're getting a sense of encouragement and the potential to be fuller, more complete, and less haunted, and to feel fresh.
As I was listening to a few interviews with some of the astronauts that have been far enough out in space where they can actually look back at Earth, and so they have what's they call the overview effect. And the way that they each describe this overview effect is actually quite similar to spending weeks and weeks and weeks of retreat here. It's like the mind, it's like ultimately here you're able to really look at the mind with a telescope, with a pretty fine, high-powered telescope, and it's what they're doing there. And it's fascinating to hear how that has changed and shaped them, how there's this it's the only time you get a really true sense of how small we actually are and how vast the universe and everything actually. We get caught up in our day-to-day things and thinking that we completely lose perspective in our celebrity-driven blah, 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 all of that. And to have that experience, I realized as I was listening to them, they're talking about the shift of consciousness in the same way that happens if you have a good amount of time consistently on retreat, that it's a similar thing that happens.
That sense that people have had a hard time, a good time, a mixture of both usually, but they're looking back and they're feeling this immense and deep gratitude for having stopped running around doing 59 things for a while and coming to earth. Literally, coming to earth, coming to having had some time to be more like a human body on the earth. And the relief of that, and that sense of that is a reason to book your next retreat as soon as you get home, because you know you're going to forget and you're going to be whirled up again into the world of doing and ideas and the frenzy and the suffering of the world, and you'll leave the earth. And I think the significance of that starts to really hit home when you're somewhere like this for a length of time. It's not just a sense of one's own healing and awakening, but a sense of kind of, oh my gosh, you know, I live a lot of my life somewhere else. I'm not really here. And it feels so good to be here when then somehow you have this different perspective on what's difficult and what's lovely. You have this sense of the preciousness and the joyfulness of life that has nothing to do with whether I'm okay or everything's going fine. You know, I know it's, yeah.
It's always interesting to think both in looking back, you know, and where we've come from the last 20 years, but also to imagine, you know, okay, well, what might the next 20 years be like? One of the things to me that has been so remarkable about the beginning of IMS, the retreat center, like almost 50 years ago, and the beginning of the Forest Refuge, which is now 20 years ago, is that if there's a vision, you know, and there's kind of wholesome mind states behind it, a lot can be accomplished. And we've just seen this. We've seen so much manifest, you know, over these last almost 50 years for IMS in general. It's just like putting out a possibility, putting out a vision. And especially connected to the Dharma, it inspires so many people, you know, because the practice has benefited so many people. It's just amazing how the energy comes together from so many to create these wonderful places. And so I have a lot of trust in the Dharma in that regard, as well as, of course, one's own practice, that it really does support, you know, the manifestation of all these efforts.